If you'd told me that night would end with my husband's boss holding my hand in front of 300 people and saying he'd spent 20 years searching for me, I would have laughed in your face. I was standing in the corner of that ballroom, in a dress I bought on clearance, trying to disappear into the wallpaper, the way I'd learned to do at every one of Richard's work events. I didn't know that in exactly 4 minutes, my whole life was about to split into a before and an after. I didn't know I was about to become visible again. My name is Lisa Walker. I'm 43 years old, and for 18 years I have been Richard Walker's wife first and myself somewhere a distant second. That night, the Whitmore Group was throwing its 25th anniversary gala at the Marriott downtown, all crystal chandeliers and white tablecloths, and a string quartet playing something that sounded expensive. Richard had spent an hour in front of the mirror adjusting his tie, telling me which version of myself would be acceptable for the evening. "Wear the navy dress," he'd said, not asking. "And Lisa, please try not to talk too much tonight. These are important people." I wore the navy dress. I always did what kept the peace. Inside the ballroom, Richard transformed the way he always did at these things, laughing too loud at his co-workers' jokes, touching elbows, working the room like a man auditioning for a bigger life. I trailed behind him for the first 20 minutes, smiling when he introduced me, which wasn't often. Mostly I stood near the appetizer table with a glass of white wine I wasn't really drinking, watching my husband perform. At one point, he pulled me aside, his hand tight around my upper arm, his voice low and sharp near my ear. "Don't embarrass me," he said. "You're standing there like you don't know anyone. Smile more. Say something." I looked at him and felt the familiar ache settle into my chest, the one that had been there so long I'd almost stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing a low hum in an old house. I didn't argue. I never argued. I just nodded and stepped back into my corner, watching him rejoin a cluster of men in expensive suits who barely registered I existed. "I want you to understand something about me before I go further. I am not a woman who complains easily. I grew up believing that quiet women were strong women, that swallowing your hurt was a kind of dignity. So I stood there in that navy dress, invisible on purpose, and I told myself this was simply what marriage looked like after 18 years. I told myself a lot of things that night that weren't true. The room's energy shifted before I understood why. Conversations dropped to murmurs. Heads turned toward the entrance. I followed everyone's gaze and saw him. Charles Whitmore, the chairman himself. I'd heard Richard talk about him constantly, always with a mixture of fear and hunger in his voice, the way ambitious men talk about the person who holds their future in one hand. Charles Whitmore was 62, silver-haired, tall, in a way that commanded a room without trying. He moved through the crowd, shaking hands, nodding, saying a few words to each person, but his eyes kept scanning past them, searching for something. Then his eyes landed on me. I watched something happen to his face that I still can't fully describe. It wasn't recognition exactly, not at first. It was more like a man seeing a ghost he'd stopped believing in. He stopped mid-sentence with someone else and just stared at me across that crowded room, and I felt my skin go cold because I had no idea who he was. He started walking toward me. Not toward Richard, not toward anyone else. Toward me. The crowd parted the way it does for powerful men, and I stood frozen by the appetizer table, my wine glass suddenly heavy in my hand, wondering if I'd done something wrong, if I was about to be scolded for existing too loudly after all. He stopped in front of me. Up close, his eyes were pale gray, and they were wet. "It's you," he said so quietly at first I almost didn't hear him over the quartet. Then he reached out and took my hand in both of his, and his voice cracked as it rose. "I've spent 20 years looking for you." The room went silent around us. I mean that literally. The conversations died. The quartet kept playing, but nobody was listening anymore. Every single person in that ballroom turned to look at the chairman of the company holding the hand of a woman nobody important had ever bothered to learn the name of. I searched his face for something familiar and found nothing. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice thin. "I think you have me confused with someone else." "No," he said, and he was shaking his head, gripping my hand tighter, tears actually starting to slide down his face in front of everyone, in front of his board members, his executives, his employees. "No, I would know your face anywhere. 20 years and I would know you anywhere. I looked past his shoulder and found Richard standing near the bar, his glass frozen halfway to his mouth, his face drained of every ounce of its usual confidence. He looked like a man watching his entire understanding of the world crack open in real time. I had no idea standing there with a stranger's tears falling onto my hand that the woman this powerful man was looking for was someone I had almost managed to forget myself. I stood there with my hand still caught in his, and the whole ballroom seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for me to explain something I couldn't explain because I genuinely did not know this man. I searched his face again, the silver hair, the pale eyes, the deep lines around his mouth that suggested a life of both success and something harder underneath it, and nothing clicked. I felt panic rising in my throat, that particular flavor of panic that comes from being watched by hundreds of people while feeling completely lost. "I'm sorry," I said again, gently pulling my hand back. "I really don't know who you are." Something in his expression softened like he'd expected this. He wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand, unashamed of the tears in front of his entire company, which told me more about him in that moment than anything he could have said. Powerful men don't usually cry in ballrooms unless something has cracked all the way through them. 20 years ago, he said, his voice steadier now, though still thick with emotion. I was driving home from Charlotte on Route 9. There was a storm, the kind where you can't see 3 feet past your headlights. I hit a patch of black ice and went off the road into a ditch. My car was crushed on the driver's side. I couldn't get the door open. I couldn't feel my legs. I felt something stir in the back of my mind, distant and blurry like a dream I'd had once, and never quite remembered. I was 29 years old. He continued, newly divorced, drinking too much, driving too fast. Because I didn't much care what happened to me that year. I thought I was going to die in that ditch. And then there was a woman. She'd been driving the other direction, saw my taillights at a strange angle, and stopped. The blurry thing in my mind started to take shape. A diner, a double shift, rain hammering the windshield of my old Honda. She climbed down into that ditch in the freezing rain. He said, in her work uniform, no coat, and she pried that door open with her bare hands until her palms were bleeding. She got me out. She held pressure on a cut on my head with her own scarf the whole ambulance ride because I wouldn't stop bleeding and she wouldn't let go of me. At the hospital, she stayed until I was stable enough for surgery. She's the reason I'm standing in this room today, Mrs. Walker. I felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me. I was 23 years old back then, working the night shift at a diner outside Charlotte to pay for the community college classes I was taking during the day, still holding on to the idea that my life was going somewhere. I remembered that storm. I remembered a man's car folded like a soda can in a ditch, remembered the sound he made when I finally got the door open, somewhere between a sob and a laugh, remembered his blood on my scarf. I remembered leaving before he woke up. "I only had a first name," Charles said. And now his voice was almost pleading, like he needed me to understand the years behind this moment. "Lisa. That's all it said on the hospital admission form where you signed as an emergency contact so they'd treat me. Lisa, no last name. I woke up and you were gone, and I spent months trying to find you. I went back to every diner within 50 miles. I hired someone eventually, years later, once I had money to hire someone. But Lisa is a common name. And you'd left no trail. I never found you." "I didn't think it mattered," I said quietly, and it was true. In my mind, I had simply done what anyone would do. I hadn't stayed to be thanked because I didn't think I deserved thanks for not driving past a dying man. I had my own life to get back to, a diner shift ending at 6 in the morning, a mother who needed help with rent. I never once in 20 years thought about that man in the ditch as anything other than a stranger I'd helped on an ordinary terrible night. But for him, apparently, it had been the hinge his entire life turned on. "You saved my life when I had absolutely no reason to keep living it," Charles said. "And then you vanished like you'd never existed. Mrs. Walker, I built this company in the years after that accident. Every decision I made as a man who understood he'd been given a second chance by a stranger who wanted nothing in return. I looked for you for 2 decades because I never got to say thank you properly. and it has eaten at me every single year that passed. I became aware slowly of the room around us again, of the faces staring, of camera phones quietly rising in the back of the crowd, of Richard standing frozen by the bar, with an expression I had never once seen on him in 18 years of marriage. Not anger yet. Something closer to disbelief, like a man realizing the furniture in his own house had been rearranged without his knowledge. "I don't know what to say," I told Charles honestly. "You don't have to say anything," he said, and for the first time since he'd approached me, he smiled a real smile, exhausted and grateful all at once. "You already said everything you needed to say 20 years ago. I just never got the chance to hear it as anything but a stranger's kindness. Tonight I finally get to know your name." Somewhere behind him, I heard someone whisper to a coworker loud enough for half the room to catch it. "That's Richard's wife." Richard didn't know. I didn't look at Richard. I didn't need to. I could feel his humiliation radiating across the ballroom like heat off a summer sidewalk, and for the first time in a very long while, I felt something other than the urge to shrink myself down to protect him from it. Charles Whitmore didn't let go of the moment. Some men would have said their piece and stepped back embarrassed by their own display of emotion in front of a room full of employees. Charles did the opposite. He turned to face the crowd, keeping one hand resting lightly near my elbow like he was afraid I might disappear again if he stopped anchoring me to the room, and he raised his voice so the whole ballroom could hear him clearly. "I want everyone to understand who this woman is," he said, and the room already silent seemed to lean in closer. 20 years ago, before this company existed, before any of you worked here, I was a dying man in a ditch on the side of a road. This woman pulled me out with her bare hands. She rode in the ambulance with me. She stayed until I was safe, and then she left without telling me her name, without asking for anything, without ever expecting to be thanked. A murmur rolled through the crowd. I saw board members exchanging glances, saw younger employees pulling out their phones to record, saw the kind of awe on people's faces that usually gets reserved for celebrities, not for tired women in clearance rack dresses. If she hadn't stopped that night, Charles continued, "There is no Whitmore Group. There are no jobs in this room. There is no anniversary to celebrate. Every single person here who has built a career, a home, a life through this company owes a debt to a woman none of us knew existed until tonight." I felt my face go hot. I wasn't used to being looked at, let alone looked at like that, like something precious that had been misplaced and finally found. Part of me wanted to sink into the floor. Another part of me, a part I hadn't felt in a very long time, stood a little straighter. Then Charles turned toward Richard, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "Richard," he said, and my husband flinched at the sound of his own name. "Your wife saved my life, and I've been married to the story of that night for 20 years, wondering who she was. You've been married to her for 18. Did you know—" Richard's mouth opened and closed. I watched him search for something clever to say, some way to spin this into a version of the story where he still came out looking competent, in control, the man who had everything handled. What came out instead was weak and immediate. "She never mentioned it," he said, forcing a laugh that landed flat in the silence. "You know how it is, 20 years a lot happens. I'm sure she just forgot to— You didn't know your own wife saved the chairman's life." Someone said from the crowd, not unkindly, more disbelieving than anything, but the words hung there like a verdict. I recognized the voice. It was Dave Marsh, one of Richard's colleagues from the finance floor, a man Richard had complained about for years, calling him a suck-up, a climber. Dave wasn't trying to humiliate Richard, he was simply saying out loud what everyone in that room was now thinking. Richard's face went through several shades of red. I had seen my husband angry before, seen him irritated, seen him condescending, but I had never seen him this specific kind of exposed, the exposure of a man who has spent years building a certain image and watched it crack in under 5 minutes. "I'm sure there's a lot Lisa doesn't share," he said, trying to recover, glancing at me now with something sharp behind his eyes, a warning I recognized from 18 years of marriage. "Don't make this worse for me. She's not really one for the spotlight." "Clearly not," Charles said, and there was an edge in his voice now, subtle but unmistakable, the tone of a man who had built an empire by reading people accurately. which makes it all the more remarkable that she never used what she'd done to get anything from anyone. Not recognition, not money, not even a thank you card. That's rare, Richard. That's the kind of person most companies would kill to have walking their halls, and you had her at your dinner table for 18 years. I stayed quiet through all of it. I didn't correct Richard. I didn't defend myself. I didn't need to, because for the first time in a very long time, someone else was doing the seeing for me, and my silence wasn't the silence of a woman shrinking. It was the silence of a woman finally being witnessed. Charles gestured toward the head table near the stage where the company's senior leadership was seated. Mrs. Walker, would you do me the honor of joining me tonight? I've spent 2 decades wanting to properly thank the woman who gave me my life back. I'd like the chance to start tonight. Richard stepped forward, slightly straightening his jacket, already assuming the invitation extended to him as well. The way it always had, the way every door that opened for me in our marriage somehow became a door he walked through first. Charles's eyes flicked to him, polite but final. Mrs. Walker is my guest tonight, he said, and it wasn't cruel, just clear, the kind of sentence that draws a line without raising its voice. I watched my husband stand there in front of his colleagues, in front of his boss, in front of everyone whose opinion he had spent his career chasing, and realize he had just been quietly, publicly set aside. I felt something unfamiliar move through my chest as Charles offered his arm, and I took it, walking toward the head table while 300 people watched. It wasn't triumph exactly. It was something quieter than that. It felt like being seen for the first time in longer than I could remember, and realizing how much I had missed it without ever letting myself admit it. Sitting at that head table surrounded by china, I would never have bought myself in conversation. I wasn't sure how to join. I found my mind drifting backward through 18 years of marriage, trying to understand how I had become a woman. Nobody at that table, including her own husband, actually knew. I met Richard when I was 25, 2 years after that night on Route 9. He was ambitious even then, still climbing the lower rungs of a mid-sized logistics firm, handsome in a sharp-edged way, the kind of man who made you feel chosen when he looked at you and invisible when he didn't. I mistook his intensity for depth. I mistook his need for control for strength. I was young enough and tired enough from years of working double shifts to keep myself afloat. That being chosen by someone who seemed so certain about the future felt like relief. It didn't happen all at once, the smallness. That's the part people don't understand about marriages like mine. Richard never sat me down and told me to disappear. Instead, it was small, patient erosion spread across years. Early on, when I mentioned wanting to finish my degree, he'd smile and say we couldn't afford it right now, not with his career taking off. And wasn't it more important that one of us focused on home? When I got excited about a part-time job at a local nonprofit, he asked what people would think a woman with his last name working retail hours. When I spoke up at dinner parties, offered an opinion at a barbecue, laughed too loudly at my own joke, I'd get the look. The private corrective look that told me I'd embarrassed him again. "You're just not corporate material, Lisa," he told me once years ago when I'd asked about applying to an admin job at his company. "Some people are built for that world. You're better at, the home stuff." I believed him. That's the part that still stings sitting there at that head table 20 years later. I believed him for so long that I stopped testing whether it was true. I never told Richard about the man in the ditch because honestly, it never occurred to me that it mattered. To me, it had been one night among thousands. An instinct followed a stranger helped nothing more remarkable than stopping to help someone change a flat tire. I hadn't buried the memory out of shame or trauma. I had simply filed it away as something small because I had never been taught that the things I did mattered enough to keep. Charles, seated beside me, now seemed to sense where my thoughts had wandered. He leaned in slightly, his voice pitched just for me beneath the noise of the room. "I went back to that hospital 3 times over the years," he said. "I talked to nurses who barely remembered the night. I hired an investigator in my 30s when I finally had the money to do it properly. He found nothing. No last name, no address, just Lisa, and a description that could have matched 1,000 women. I didn't know anyone was looking," I said quietly. "I kept the scarf," he said, and something in his voice cracked slightly on the words. "The one you used on my head. I don't know why I never threw it out. It's been in a drawer in my office for 20 years, this ridiculous sentimental thing, a grown man keeping a blood-stained scarf, because it was the only proof I had that you were real, and not something I imagined while I was half-conscious and terrified. I didn't know what to say to that. There's no polished response to learning that a stranger built a shrine out of your kindness while you forgot his face entirely. I want to be honest with you. Charles continued quieter, still glancing briefly toward where Richard sat 2 tables away, stiff, and watching us like a man trying to read lips. It wasn't only gratitude that kept me looking. Somewhere in those months I spent recovering, thinking about the woman who saved me and vanished, it became something more than thanks. I built an entire idea of you in my mind, a version of you that was probably unfair, too perfect, too mythologized. I told myself if I ever found you, I'd simply say thank you and let you go on with your life. He paused, and I watched him decide whether to say the rest. But sitting here tonight, watching how your husband spoke about you, how this room reacted to discovering who you actually are, I don't think the woman I imagined was unfair at all. I think she was exactly right, and I think she's been sitting in rooms like this for years without anyone noticing her. I felt heat rise in my face, not from flattery exactly, but from the strange vertigo of being truly seen by someone after so long being merely tolerated. I glanced across the room at Richard, who was watching us with an expression I recognized from every argument we'd ever had, the tight jaw, the controlled fury simmering just beneath a composed surface. He hated this. He hated that I was the center of something he couldn't manage or minimize. For what it's worth. I told Charles, I don't regret not telling anyone. I didn't do it to be found. I did it because you needed help and I was there. I know, he said, and he smiled, the exhaustion in his face finally softening into something gentler. That's exactly why it mattered so much. Across the table, a woman from the board leaned toward me and asked kindly what I did for work these days, clearly expecting an impressive answer to match the story. I opened my mouth to say I didn't work, that I hadn't in years, that Richard had always said one income was plenty as long as everything at home ran smoothly, and I felt the old shame start to climb up my throat. Then I stopped myself. I looked at Charles, at his scarf kept in a drawer for 20 years, at his belief that I'd been worth searching for, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the need to shrink the truth to make it more comfortable for anyone else in the room. The gala wound down close to 11, and by the time I found my coat, Richard was already waiting by the parking garage elevator, arms crossed, jaw tight, in that way I'd learned over 18 years to read like a weather forecast. I knew before he said a word that the storm had been building all night and I was about to walk straight into it. The elevator doors closed, and he didn't wait for privacy. "What the hell was that?" he said, his voice low but sharp, bouncing off the concrete walls of the parking structure. "You couldn't have mentioned that you knew Charles Whitmore, 20 years of marriage, and you just what forgot to tell me you saved my boss's life." "I didn't know he was your boss," I said. "I didn't even know his last name until tonight, Richard. I met a man in a ditch. I didn't file the story away for later use. You made me look like an idiot in front of the entire company." He punched the elevator button again, though it was already lit, a habit of his when he wanted to feel like he was doing something with his hands. "Do you understand what people are going to say on Monday? That I don't even know my own wife. That she's been sitting on some connection to the chairman this whole time." "I wasn't sitting on anything," I said, and I heard something in my own voice that surprised me, a steadiness that hadn't been there in arguments like this before. "I helped a stranger because he needed help. That's all it ever was until tonight." He wasn't listening. He rarely was in moments like this, too busy constructing the version of events where he remained the wronged party. We walked to the car in silence, and the moment the doors shut, he started again, quieter now, but somehow sharper for it. "You embarrassed me tonight," he said. Standing there, letting him hold your hand, letting the whole room watch, letting Dave Marsh say that thing about me not knowing my own wife. Did you enjoy that? Is that what this was, some kind of performance? "You told me not to embarrass you before we even walked in," I said. "You told me to smile more, talk less, stay small. I did exactly what you asked, Richard. I stood in a corner and said nothing. Charles Whitmore is the one who walked across that room and changed everything, not me. Don't act innocent." His hands tightened on the steering wheel as he pulled out of the garage headlights, sweeping across empty concrete. A man like that doesn't get emotional over some diner waitress from 20 years ago unless there was something more to it. What exactly happened that night? Lisa, what aren't you telling me? The accusation landed like a slap, uglier for how casually he delivered it, like he was simply thinking out loud rather than accusing his wife of something filthy in a parking garage at 11 at night. I felt something old and tired inside me, finally give out the last thread of a rope I'd been holding for years. You were embarrassed by me before anyone in that room even knew my name, I said, turning to look at him directly. You've been embarrassed by me for years, Richard. The way I dress, the way I talk, the fact that I never finished my degree because you told me we couldn't afford it. You built a life where I existed to make you look good at parties and disappear the rest of the time, and now you're furious because for one night I mattered more than you did. He didn't answer that. Instead, his voice dropped into something colder, more deliberate. You'd better watch yourself, he said. If this turns into some kind of scandal, if people start talking that reflects on my career. You understand that, right? If you make this into more than it is, you're going to regret it. I looked out the window at the city lights blurring past and said nothing else for the rest of the drive. I had learned over 18 years that there was no version of this argument where being right protected me from the consequences of having an opinion. I went to bed that night with his threat still hanging in the air between us, and I didn't sleep much. Monday morning, everything changed again, though not in the way Richard feared. He was called into human resources before 9. I only learned the details later, pieced together from a phone call he made that evening, his voice tight with a panic I'd never heard from him before. It turned out Charles Whitmore had done more than sit with me at a head table Friday night. Once his curiosity about the woman who saved his life had led him back into his own company's affairs, he'd started asking quiet questions, the kind powerful men ask when something doesn't sit right. What surfaced wasn't pretty. Richard had over several years taken credit for a junior analyst's cost reduction proposal that had earned him his last promotion. He'd padded expense reports on 2 regional trips. He'd used photographs of our home of me at a company picnic years ago, smiling in a sundress I didn't even remember choosing in an internal newsletter profile that painted him as a devoted family man building the ideal American life, all while privately telling me I embarrassed him. Charles hadn't ordered the investigation out of jealousy or personal feeling toward me. That wasn't who he was, I would come to understand. He simply began looking closely at the man whose wife had quietly, without ever asking for anything, changed the course of his life, and what he found didn't need any help from me to be damning. Richard called it a witch hunt. He called it retaliation. He called it everything except what it actually was, which was the truth catching up to a man who had spent years assuming no one was paying close enough attention to notice. 3 weeks passed before I saw Charles Whitmore again outside of the fog of that gala night. He called first, which I appreciated more than he probably realized, asking if I would be willing to meet him for coffee, no agenda, just a chance to talk without 300 people watching. I chose a small place downtown, not one of the polished spots near his office, because I wanted somewhere I could still recognize myself in the mirror behind the counter. He was already there when I arrived, no entourage, no assistant trailing him with a tablet, just a tired-looking man in a gray sweater, who stood up too quickly when he saw me like he was nervous. It was strange seeing him like that, stripped of the ballroom and the spotlight, just a person. "Thank you for coming," he said, pulling out my chair before I could do it myself, an old habit I imagined he'd had long before he was ever rich enough for it to seem performative. "I wanted to apologize to you." "For what?" I asked, genuinely confused. In my mind, he was the only person from that entire evening who hadn't done anything to apologize for turning your life upside down, he said, wrapping both hands around his coffee cup like he needed somewhere to put his nervous energy. I've thought about it constantly since that night. I walked into that ballroom looking for closure I'd wanted for 20 years, and I got it in the worst possible way in front of your husband, in front of his colleagues. I didn't think about what that moment would cost you when you went home. "You didn't cost me anything I hadn't already been losing slowly for years," I said, and I meant it. "You just made it visible." He looked at me for a long moment, and I watched him decide something, some careful, deliberate choice about what to say next. "I want to be clear about something," he said. "I'm not here to pull you out of your marriage. I'm not going to use anything, my position, the investigation, any of it, to make you feel obligated toward me. That's not who I want to be to you. I spent 20 years thinking of you as an idea, someone I owed my life to. I don't want to spend the next 20 making you feel owned by that debt." I felt something in my chest loosen slightly, a tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying since the moment he'd first said my name in that ballroom, the fear that gratitude might curdle into something that expected repayment. 20 years ago. He continued quieter now. "You saved my life. Today I just want you to stop losing yours." I didn't answer right away. I stirred my coffee, though I hadn't put anything in it that needed stirring, buying myself time, because the truth was I'd been asking myself a version of that same question every night since the gala, lying awake next to a man who had spent the drive home threatening me instead of comforting me. What had my life become, exactly? I tried to remember the last time I'd made a decision purely because I wanted to, not because it would keep Richard's temper calm, or preserve some fragile peace in our house. I couldn't find one. Not in months. Maybe not in years. I had built myself into a shape that fit neatly into the corners of his life, and somewhere along the way, I had stopped noticing there was a woman underneath that shape who used to want things. Richard tried in his own way over those same weeks to pull things back together. He came home one evening with flowers and apology already forming on his lips before he'd even set his keys down. "I've been under so much pressure at work," he said, standing in our kitchen with the flowers held out like a shield. "I said some things I didn't mean. You know, I don't actually think you did anything wrong that night." I looked at the flowers, cheap grocery store carnations, the kind you buy when you're in a hurry to fix something rather than genuinely sorry for breaking it. I thought about the parking garage, his voice cold and accusing, the threat wrapped inside a warning about my behavior, reflecting on his career. "Is this because you're worried about me?" I asked. "Or because you're worried about what happens to your job now that the investigation has started?" He didn't answer fast enough. That told me everything. I want to be honest about what happened inside me over those 3 weeks, because it wasn't dramatic, not the way people expect these turning points to be. There was no single moment of clarity, no lightning bolt. It was slower than that, more like waking gradually from a long sleep, becoming aware inch by inch of how small a room I'd been living in. I started remembering things about myself I'd let go dormant. That I used to love drawing actual pencil sketches I'd fill notebooks with before Richard called it a waste of time. That I used to have opinions about politics, about books, about the world, and used to share them out loud before I learned that sharing them cost more than it was worth. I started remembering that the woman who climbed into a ditch in a rainstorm to save a stranger had been brave, genuinely brave, and that bravery hadn't just disappeared. It had been buried under years of being told to make myself smaller. The night I finally decided, Richard came home late from a meeting with HR, his face gray, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and told me, without quite meeting my eyes, that he might be facing a formal reprimand, possibly termination, depending on what the investigation turned up about the expense reports and the analyst's proposal. "I need you on my side right now," he said. "Whatever happens, I need people to see that our marriage is solid, that this hasn't broken us." I understood finally and completely that even in his worst moment he was still asking me to perform for him, still asking me to be the prop that made his life look acceptable to everyone watching. I stood up from the table, walked to my jewelry box, and took out my wedding ring. I set it on the table between us, the gold catching the kitchen light, 18 years reduced to one small, quiet gesture. "I didn't embarrass you, Richard," I said, and my voice didn't shake at all. "I exposed you. Those are two very different things, and I think somewhere underneath everything you've always known the difference." I left him sitting there at the table staring at the ring, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I walked up the stairs to our bedroom feeling like the air around me had gotten bigger. I didn't run into Charles Whitmore's arms the week I left Richard. I want to be clear about that because it would have been the easy story to tell, the neat bow to tie on everything that had happened. Instead, I moved into a small one-bedroom apartment across town, the kind with second-hand furniture and a leaky kitchen faucet, I fixed myself with a video tutorial and more patience than skill. I needed more than anything to find out who I was when nobody was asking me to be smaller. The divorce took 4 months to finalize. Richard didn't fight me on much, which surprised me until I understood why. He was too consumed with his own unraveling at work to spend much energy on ours. The internal investigation confirmed what Charles had quietly suspected: the padded expense reports, the credit taken for work that wasn't his, and Richard was demoted from his management position, moved to a smaller role with a smaller office and a much smaller audience for his charm. He wasn't destroyed. I want to say that clearly because I never wanted his ruin, only the truth. He kept his job, kept a paycheck, kept his pride bruised but intact. He simply had to live finally with the consequences of years spent believing no one important was watching closely enough to notice who he really was. I saw him once more at the courthouse signing the last of our papers. He looked older than I remembered, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "I hope you're happy," he said, and I couldn't tell if it was bitterness or something closer to genuine hope. I told him I hoped the same for him, and I meant it because carrying anger for a man who no longer had any power over my days felt like a waste of the freedom I'd fought so hard to have. Charles didn't call for weeks at a time during those months, respecting the space I clearly needed, though he did send a card when the divorce finalized, simple and warm, no pressure, folded into the words. Instead, our paths crossed slowly, naturally, through something unexpected. He invited me to visit a foundation his company had quietly funded for years, a program supporting women rebuilding their lives after leaving controlling or abusive marriages, offering job training, temporary housing assistance, and something I found I needed just as much as anyone else there: a community of women who understood exactly what it cost to make themselves small for someone else's comfort. I hesitated when he first suggested I get involved beyond just visiting. Volunteering felt like one thing. Stepping into any kind of real role felt like admitting I was ready to be seen again, in a way I wasn't sure I trusted yet. But something about walking those halls, meeting women in their 30s and 50s and 60s who were all learning to trust their own voices again, felt less like charity and more like recognition. I said yes. I started small, helping organize workshops, sharing pieces of my own story, when it felt right, never performing it, just offering it honestly to women who needed to hear that starting over at 43 wasn't a tragedy, it was a beginning. Within a year, I was speaking regularly at foundation events, my old fear of taking up space in a room slowly, deliberately being replaced by something steadier. Charles and I built our relationship the same slow way, no rush, no grand gestures beyond that first one at the gala, which had honestly been enough grand gesture to last a lifetime. We had dinner occasionally. We talked on the phone some evenings about nothing important, about books and weather and the small textures of ordinary days, which felt like a luxury after 18 years of conversations that were really just management meetings for Richard's ego. Charles never once made me feel like I owed him anything for that night on Route 9, and somewhere in that patience, something real grew between us, unhurried and honest. 9 months after the gala, the foundation held its annual benefit dinner, the same kind of grand ballroom setting where this entire story had begun, though this time I wasn't hiding in a corner in clearance rack navy. I stood at a podium in a deep green dress I'd chosen entirely for myself, looking out at a room full of people who had come to support women exactly like the one I used to be. I found Charles in the front row before I started speaking, his eyes steady on mine, proud in a way that didn't feel like ownership, just genuine gladness at watching someone become fully themselves. For years, I told that room my voice carrying clear and unshaking through the microphone. I thought being quiet meant being strong. I thought disappearing a little more each year was just what it meant to keep a family together. It took a stranger from 20 years ago walking back into my life to remind me that the woman who once climbed into a ditch in a rainstorm to save someone else was never actually gone. She was just waiting for permission to come back. But sometimes, real strength isn't staying quiet to keep the peace. Sometimes strength is finally letting the world hear your name. The applause that followed felt less like praise and more like recognition, dozens of women in that room nodding because they understood exactly what those words had cost me to say out loud. Afterward, Charles found me near the edge of the room, 2 glasses of champagne in hand, and offered me one with a small, hopeful smile. "Would you have dinner with me sometime?" he asked. "Not because you saved my life 20 years ago, but because I'd simply like to know you now as the person you've chosen to become." I looked at him, at this man who had waited 2 decades and then waited patiently again for me to find my own way back to myself, and I felt something settle warmly in my chest that had nothing to do with debt or rescue. "This time," I said, smiling, "you don't have to look for me. If this story moved you even a little, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from tonight. So leave it in the comments below, and if you believe every quiet woman deserves the chance to finally be seen, hit subscribe, because we've got so many more stories like Lisa's waiting to be told, and I don't want you to miss a single one.